We are meeting today with the government officials to receive an update on Canada's critical transportation infrastructure. Specifically, we will discuss the recommendations made in the 12th report of the 44th Parliament of the Standing Senate Committee on Transport and Communications entitled Urgent Building Climate Resilience Across Canada's Critical Transportation Infrastructure. With that, I would like to introduce from Transport Canada, geez, that sounds like I'm going to go, I don't have any drum rolls, but from Transport Canada, Paul Sander Cruz, Director General, Strategic Policy. From Public Safety Canada, Ryan Schwartz, Director, Critical Infrastructure, Policy and Analysis. And from Environment and Climate Change Canada, Jeff McDonald, Director General, Climate Change Adaptation. Mr. Sandar Cruz is also accompanied by a few other officials from Transport Canada. If they are here to assist answering any technical questions. Should any of the officials be called to the table to answer questions, please state your name and title before you begin speaking. Thank you to all for joining us today. Witnesses will provide opening remarks of approximately 5 minutes. I'd ask you to respect that amount of time, which would be followed by a question and answer session with senators. I will now invite Mr. Sandar Cruz to give his opening remarks. Sir, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today in relation to your report, Urgent Building Climate Resilience Across Canada's Critical Transportation Infrastructure. Canada's economic prosperity and connectivity depend on a transportation system that moves people and goods efficiently and reliably. Your report highlights how climate change and extreme weather events, including wildfires, flooding, are increasingly disrupting trade flows, isolating communities, and adding costs. Transport Canada works with provinces, territories, Indigenous partners, and industry to improve system performance, enhance visibility across key transportation corridors, and better anticipate and respond to disruptions. Through this work, we engage and coordinate with Public Safety Canada and other key federal partners to identify, prioritize, and protect Canada's critical transportation infrastructure. Our all-hazards approach ensures that climate risks such as flooding, wildfire, permafrost thaw, coastal erosion, and extreme precipitation are integrated into our risk assessments and infrastructure planning, and that these efforts align with our responsibilities under the Emergency Management Act and the Federal Emergency Response Plan. Additionally, Transport Canada has analyzed the economic and supply chain impacts of major climate events, including the 2021 British Columbia atmospheric river, the 2022 Vancouver winter storms, and wildfires in British Columbia, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories between 2021 and 2024. These analyses helped identify vulnerable corridors and assets to inform strategic investment decisions. Transport Canada has delivered targeted adaptation programs, including the Transportation Assets Risk Assessment Initiative, the Northern Transportation Adaptation Initiative, and the Rail Climate Change Adaptation Program. These initiatives have laid the groundwork for strengthening climate resilience across all transportation modes. Climate risk assessments have also been embedded in project evaluation to ensure that infrastructure investments are durable and adaptable. Through the National Trade Corridors Fund, we have invested $4.1 billion in 214 projects nationally, including projects that address climate-related vulnerabilities. We are now building on those efforts through major new transportation infrastructure funding programs announced in Budget 2025. This includes the $5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund and the $1 billion Arctic Infrastructure Fund. These investments provide an opportunity to enhance the efficiency and reliability of Canada's transportation system while ensuring its climate resilience. This is particularly urgent in Canada's Arctic, which is warming nearly 4 times faster than the global average and faces unique transportation challenges including permafrost thaw, coastal erosion, and shorter winter road seasons. The National Trade Corridors Fund has invested in 33 projects in the Arctic in the north, totaling $932.6 million in federal contributions and leveraging $1.6 in total investments from multiple partners. Building on this record, the new Arctic Infrastructure Fund will focus on dual-use transportation infrastructure that is particularly vulnerable to climate change. We are combining scientific expertise with local and Indigenous knowledge to ensure projects reflect regional realities and adaptation needs. Climate risk assessments aligned with international standards are embedded in project delivery to ensure that infrastructure can withstand extreme weather and long-term climate impacts. Additionally, Northern and Indigenous communities understand the risks they face daily. Their knowledge is essential to designing practical, locally grounded solutions that address permafrost thaw, flooding, wildfires, and coastal erosion. Transport Canada's role is to support and scale those local solutions through funding, technical guidance, and collaboration with federal, provincial, territorial, and Indigenous partners so that infrastructure investments strengthen resilience, durability, and long-term socio-economic benefits for Canadians. Merci. Mes collègues et moi serons heureux de répondre à vos.
Thank you, my colleagues, and I will be pleased to answer your questions.
Cruz, we will now invite Mr. Schwartz to give his opening remarks.
Bonjour et merci, Monsieur le Président, Madame la Vice-Présidente.
Thank you, Chair, Madam Vice Chair, and honourable members, to give me this opportunity to give you an update of the Canadian government's approach with respect to the safety and resilience of key infrastructure.
And I thank you for the report, Urgent Building Climate Resilience Across Canada's Critical Transportation Infrastructure. I would begin by noting that Canada defines critical infrastructure, or CI, very broadly to include the processes, systems, facilities, technologies, networks, assets, and services essential to the health, safety, security, or economic well-being of Canadians and the effective functioning of government. This definition is from the 2009 National Strategy for Critical Infrastructure, which also established 10 CI sectors, including transportation. Taken together, the definition and sectors created a framework wherein virtually anything in the Canadian economy could be considered critical depending on the nature of disruptions, their impacts, and the perspectives of stakeholders. Further, the strategy recognized that these 10 sectors are interconnected and that interdependencies create the risk of cascading failures. For example, a disruption to a major bridge, port, or rail line will create supply chain impacts in other sectors such as manufacturing. The strategy also established voluntary, collaborative approaches to enhancing CI security and resilience in recognition that is a shared responsibility. As such, the strategy focused on building partnerships, all hazards risk management, and information sharing. Legislatively, the Emergency Management Act stipulates that ministers accountable to Parliament are to identify risks within or related to their area of responsibility, including CI, and prepare emergency management plans in response to those risks. Importantly, the Emergency Management Act does not identify or therefore legally designate the infrastructure that warrants protection. Rather, Canada relies on legislation applicable to individual sectors as well as other statutes of general application, including the Criminal Code, to protect CI. Other federal departments and agencies work with industry on CI security and resilience through sector networks or other fora, and these line up as you would expect, such as Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for the food sector, and Natural Resources Canada for the energy and utilities sector. Transport Canada leads the transportation sector and partners with its stakeholders on issues of concern to enhance the resilience and reliability of our critical transportation infrastructure. Part of public safety's role is to make connections between CI sectors and ensure risks, actions, and lessons learned are shared within the Government of Canada, consistent with the Minister of Public Safety's role of exercising national leadership on this topic. CI is a high-value target for threat actors, as disruptions can impact the economy and destabilize society. Risks to CI can be of a cyber or a physical nature. Copper wire theft is an example of a physical threat that this committee has focused its attention on. Others include blockades, sabotage, and extreme weather. The challenge of safeguarding CI is growing more complex, particularly in Canada's northern and Arctic regions, as the climate and geopolitical context continue to rapidly transform. To this end, public safety has been leading federal efforts to strengthen the security and resilience of Canada's CI against all threats and hazards. These efforts have raised awareness within the interdepartmental community on the importance of this issue. The Government of Canada's emergency management and national adaptation strategies also highlight the importance of and include measures related to resilient infrastructure. In addition, CI is an undercurrent in other important initiatives, including Canada's Arctic foreign policy, Defence Policy Update, and the Defence Industrial Strategy released last week. Indeed, resilient CI is foundational for our sovereignty and security. Alors, je vais arrêter en disant que le sujet des
I'll conclude by saying that the subject of CI is vast and complex. These systems are interdependent, and disruptions can cause cascading impacts and failures. All levels of government and industry have a vital role to play in protecting the CI on which Canadians depend. Thank you for your time. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Schwartz, now I invite Mr. McDonald to give his opening remarks.
Merci, Monsieur le Président et honorable sénateur.
Thank you, Chair and Senators. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of the Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Nature to discuss the committee's 12th report. This committee's report clearly underscores the reality that we're already experiencing across the country. Climate change is no longer a future risk to transportation infrastructure. It is rather a present and growing challenge that affects safety, economic competitiveness, and the resilience of our supply chains. I would like to emphasize that the Government of Canada shares the committee's sense of urgency. We agree that building climate resilience into transportation and critical infrastructure must be a national priority.
It is advancing the core recommendations of this report through coordinated whole-of-government action under Canada's National Adaptation Strategy. This strategy was launched in 2023 and provides a comprehensive framework for reducing climate risks, protecting communities, and strengthening the resilience of critical systems, including transportation. Importantly, the strategy recognizes that adaptation is not the responsibility of any single department or level of government. Instead, it requires sustained collaboration across jurisdictions and sectors. A central focus of the strategy is the integration of climate resilience into infrastructure planning, design, and standards. In direct alignment with these recommendations from the committee, the strategy does include a commitment to incorporate climate change considerations into national codes and standards. For example, the recent Canada Highway Bridge Design Code that was designed for this year, 2026. This work will also help ensure that new and rehabilitated infrastructure is designed to withstand future climate considerations and future climate conditions rather than past ones. La Stratégie nationale d'adaptation est
The National Adaptation Strategy is also supported by targeted federal investments that are already strengthening the resilience of critical transportation corridors. Through the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, which received expanded funding under the National Adaptation Strategy, the government is supporting large-scale projects that reduce climate risks and protect supply chains. A notable example is the government's March 2025 commitment of $325 million through the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund towards the Chignik to Isthmus Resiliency Project. This investment directly supports the committee's recommendations to determine a path forward for protecting this vital transportation corridor from increasing flood risk. This investment also reflects the importance of safeguarding infrastructure that is essential to regional and national connectivity.
that much of Canada's transport infrastructure is owned and maintained at the municipal level. The National Adaptation Strategy also includes significant support for local leadership. The Local Leadership for Climate Adaptation Initiative, administered under the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Green Municipal Fund, provides $530 million in stable multi-year funding through 2031 to help municipalities integrate climate resilience into local infrastructure decisions. In particular, the initiative's financing adaptation stream advances long-term funding solutions by testing innovative financing models and leveraging private sector investment. This directly aligns with the committee's recommendation that both governments and the private sector play a role in future climate resilient infrastructure. Au-delà de la stratégie nationale d'adaptation,
Beyond the National Adaptation Strategy, Environment and Climate Change Canada continues to support evidence-based decision-making through the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. This centre provides climate data, tools, as well as guidance to infrastructure owners and planners, with a particular focus on northern and remote regions where climate impacts are often more severe and where adaptation capacity can be more limited.
We welcome the committee's report and view it as a strong complement to the actions already underway. While we recognize that significant work remains, progress is being made to embed climate resilience into transportation infrastructure across the country. We look forward to your questions and to continuing this important discussion. Merci beaucoup.
Nous allons passer maintenant aux questions des sénateurs.
Now we will move on to the question period for the senators. Senators, you have approximately 5 minutes for the first round of questions. There will be a second round of questions if time allows. If you would like to put a question to the witness, please inform our clerk, who will put your name on the list. So, Senator Dasco, I invite you to ask the first question, followed by Senators Lewis and Senator Wilson. Senator Dasco.
Witnesses for being here today. And thank you for your presentation and describing the initiatives that you're undertaking. With respect to our report, we have 10 recommendations. I wonder if you might, if we could get into that a little bit. Did you find any of the recommendations, were any of them new to you? Did you find any of them surprising? Which of the recommendations might have stood out for you in terms of the initiatives of the department? So I'd like to get a sense of, how you actually, how you responded to them, and which ones you might have seen as the most critical from your point of view. Thank you.
Who would like to start off the answer?
I'll start.
Go ahead, please.
So I think generally the recommendations speak to the urgency of the issue and the impact. So from a transportation perspective, it's not surprising to me that transportation projects themselves figure predominantly in the report. So I think from our perspective, it's taking the recommendations and the principles behind them and incorporating it into the programming that we're finalizing, that we're delivering, and the next generation of infrastructure programs and collaborative work that we're doing with our provincial territorial partners. And for the Arctic, it will be increasingly important that we engage with Department of Defense and other partners on the dual-use infrastructure, because I think that one is a tremendous opportunity for the people that live in the North, for protecting Canada's sovereignty, and for working in a new collaborative approach.
Stood out in particular in the recommendations that we made that caught your attention?
I think the hope that we would prioritize infrastructure, a list of priority infrastructure. We are doing that. We've been working collaboratively with our provincial territorial partners on trade enabling infrastructure in a transportation context that aligns with our mandate. And it's something the government has signaled its desire to double our exports to non-U.S. exports and diversify our trade. So there's an increasing importance. There's an alignment between the trade infrastructure, trade enabling transportation infrastructure, and the vulnerability aspects to climate change. Our Western Corridor is a key export gateway for Canadian trade. So there is overlap, and I think from my perspective, it's just making sure that we're targeting all of the right measures and programs to strengthen the resiliency.
Do we have any more time, Chair?
You do.
I do. Thank you very much. I'd like to focus, probe a little bit the comments about support for municipalities. Municipalities own 60% of Canada's public infrastructure, and we know that it is threatened by climate change. You mentioned one initiative. I wonder if you could describe in a little more detail the municipal initiatives that you undertake to assist municipalities. They're always broke. Oh, I have some mayors here. A mayor here. They're always they don't have they don't have enough money to pay for all of this, and that's just one of the problems they have. But I wonder if you could just describe in a little more detail what initiatives you have for municipalities. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So the $530 million that was added to the Green Municipal Fund under the National Adaptation Strategy has been starting to be implemented. So it's a top-up to the foundation. And as a result, a program called Local Leadership in Climate Adaptation was launched by the Green Municipal Fund, and it's open to municipalities across the country. I think it's interesting to note that there's emphasis put on supporting proposals where municipalities work together. I think this is very key in the context of infrastructure planning and transportation. Obviously, it's not just limited to one particular locale, but it has three particular aspects. First of all, there's a first phase where it's intended to provide support to municipalities for developing adaptation strategies for all of their operations, not just infrastructure, but in general to have a plan for how to adapt to the climate that is changing in their community. The second one is to support some projects that can demonstrate the usefulness of taking proactive action to address climate impacts before they happen. And then, as I mentioned in my remarks, there's the third one that is currently under development for financing adaptation. It's really trying to find new ways to support investment in infrastructure projects that are deemed a priority in some of the strategies that are funded in the first phase, that can bring in private sector funding and the support of outside investors as well as through government. It is true that all levels of government say there is not enough money for infrastructure. And I think one of the major goals of the first National Adaptation Strategy is to make the integration of the future climate and understanding the coming impacts of climate change, mainstreaming that into the regular business of maintenance and construction of infrastructure as well as other activities. And so having a proper strategy and supporting that through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities program, the Green Municipal Fund, was seen as a really good way of getting started in terms of especially supporting municipalities that don't necessarily have the capacity to hire the planning staff or to hire the people on their own to help with some of this initial planning. So that's really where that fund is directed.
Donald?
Yes.
We need to move forward.
Yep.
We're a little over our time. Senator Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses today for appearing before us. Climate change is far from the exact science, and as we put new regulation and requirements in place, as your department looks at new regulations and requirements, is there also a process in place where, you talk about private industry and so on wanting to invest, and we always hear about, the regulatory burden and those kind of things. And is there opportunity for private companies that are investing that, say, certain regulations are cumbersome or don't make sense? Is there a good line of communication, as we go forward with these new requirements and regulation that they'll listen to what, in a practical sense, what is being done on the ground is, and sometimes we don't get the regulations right the first time. So is there opportunity for good practical solutions as for projects of national interest and everything? You talk about the speed of what some of these have to be done at, and it's always an argument that the speed of business is not the speed of the regulator. So just like you to make comments on that, please.
Perhaps I can start. Thank you, Senator, for the question, and Mr. Chair. I think that's ultimately a question about stakeholder engagement and the importance of engaging with the private sector partners in all of these projects, whether it's existing infrastructure or new infrastructure. I think the federal government prioritizes engagement with a number of partners, and particularly in the case of critical infrastructure, the private sector, who are, in addition to municipalities, the majority owners and operators of critical infrastructure in Canada across the majority of our main CI sectors. And we have had a number of very good stakeholder engagement mechanisms through, as I mentioned, some of the sector networks that exist, whereby we bring together provinces, territories, individual companies and industry associations to talk about issues of concern related to critical infrastructure and the services that they provide to Canadians. That can be in a pandemic context, that could be in a convoy blockade context, or other sorts of disruptions. The other thing that I would mention in terms of the legislative and regulatory making process is that we are, I would say, mindful of the speed at which infrastructure needs to be built, and mindful of the regulatory burden that is placed upon on industry. And I think throughout that legislative development process, through consultations and successive rounds of reviews within both chambers of the House, that I think that there are opportunities to improve that process. One example I would give is currently Bill C8. It's the Critical Cyber Systems Protection Act, which has been reintroduced, and that would look at imposing cybersecurity obligations on four of our most critical sectors, and that has been vetted a number of times with industry stakeholders, and we have continuous mechanisms to engage. So I think that's quite a positive example of how we work in government, is working with private sector and industry.
Thank you. I'll pass my time off to other members.
Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions today are going to focus primarily around specific infrastructure across the country. I feel good about what I've heard in terms of the work that's happening at a strategic level. As we're looking to diversify trade and protect our sovereignty, I don't think there's anything more critical or core to that than protecting Canada's national supply chains. Several years ago, and you mentioned this, Mr. Sandor Cruz, in your remarks, several years ago we had a terrible flood in British Columbia, and in particular, it was significantly damaging and impactful in the Fraser Valley. And one of the things that I'm concerned about, and we're seeing more recently, we're seeing recurrences of floods, although they haven't knocked out the rail lines this time, or the highway. We have seen recurring flooding, and it's obviously going to continue. I'm concerned that I haven't seen anything material in terms of what is happening to harden the infrastructure in the Fraser Valley, and in particular, that major flood in 2021, since it originated in the United States, is outside of our sovereign control. So the committee report didn't look specifically at that. It talked about the marine ports and airports of Vancouver. But to me, this is a key piece of national infrastructure, and I'm just curious what work is being done specifically looking at the Fraser Valley.
Thank you for your question. I would say two things in terms of the work. One is around the emergency response and the monitoring of the supply chains and the lessons learned from it. So there's a multi-departmental effort around monitoring those impacts and looking at what could be done to mitigate real time and to address, minimize the impacts. The second is around the transportation network itself. And so we're doing analysis of our capacity to support the current trade levels, the projected trade levels, the pinch points, the bottlenecks, and the vulnerability to climate, flooding, and you mentioned, I know you were talking about Fraser Valley, but the Chignecto Isthmus and the East Coast as well as mentioned in the report. So that's something that's very top of mind for our analysis and program design for future infrastructure needs. I think the committee would benefit from also speaking with Housing and Infrastructure Canada, which has new programming on its community side and does does have infrastructure programs in relation to wastewater and in other municipal elements. So I think, our ultimate objective would be to be strategic in how we invest across the federal departments to protect the infrastructure that's there and to bolster our capacity to support trade.
You, in terms of working across government, we're talking about the kinds of improvements we're talking about today are in the billions of dollars. And some of the numbers that I've heard you throw out, I've heard the government announce sound like in their hundreds of millions of dollars and across the country. Is there work to, do you believe there's work to identify more funding for this kind of infrastructure than what we've heard to date?
I thank you for the question. I think there's always an opportunity to continue to work with provinces and territory to identify needs. We're through our own Transport Canada tables at a federal, provincial, territorial level, looking to understand future needs that transcend kind of some of the things that I've talked about in climate change, adaptation, the vulnerability to climate is one of those lenses. And I think we would then work with, our Environment Canada and Natural Resources Canada, housing, infrastructure, any federal department that's done some work that would help complement the knowledge, the data that we have. And then we would use that to prioritize the investments that we would be making. And also, the last thing I would add, on the transportation side, and it's been mentioned already, it's a mix of public and private assets, right? So you also have to make sure that everybody's doing their part so that the system isn't exposed to a vulnerability because there's one aspect that's beyond the reach or control of one jurisdiction.
Senator Simons.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all our witnesses for being here. This report gestated longer than an elephant. And I was reminding myself that Mr. Schwartz and Mr. Sandor Cruz, you actually testified to this committee on this report almost exactly 4 years ago. And then the report came out at the end of 2024. And so that was more than a year since the, yeah, 24. So it's been a while. So welcome back. Now, I'm trying to recall your testimony from 4 years ago, but I don't believe at that time that you told us explicitly that there were these lists and these funds. So I'm wondering, Mr. Sandor Cruz, I was quite cheered up by your opening testimony, but could you tell us when exactly these things started to fall into place?
Thank you for the question. There were specific adaptation programs. There's several. I mentioned them in my opening remarks. They've since sunset, but we also use the National Trade Corridors Fund to fund projects to look at the impacts of climate change on highway infrastructure in the territories, bridges. There's been some work in the Arctic for loading ramps. So we've used the suite of programming that we have had available, the tools that we've had, to understand the climate change risks, to look at ways of mitigating them, and we use those lessons learned as part of the future investments on the engineering side, on the next phases of infrastructure. So,
at what point do we move from studying the problem, which I think we now all know is the problem, to actually fixing the infrastructure? I mean, some of the recommendations we made, for example, specifically on the north, included investment in all-season roads, investment in port construction that is resilient to climate change for port construction in the Canadian Arctic specifically, investment in northern airport infrastructure to modernize it, and especially in where we all know that there's permafrost heave. So I'm wondering if you could tell us if any of those projects have projects or projects of that nature have been funded, or if there's a methodology to get to the point where we are actually building the highways, building the ports, fixing the runways.
So I can highlight a few that were funded by the National Trade Corridors Fund. There was a climate change resilience study for the Inuvik-Tuktoyak Highway. That was a big one. Yeah, that one was a study. There also was funding provided for the North Klondike Highway, 100-kilometer stretch between Whitehorse and Dawson. That there was a early study part, but then construction. So the phase one was announced in 2019.
Has it been built?
I will confirm for you. I'll confirm.
Okay, because obviously the studies. I'm not poo-pooing studies. We've just done one. The studies are the necessary precursors, but once we're all seized with the idea that this is a problem, I guess I'm wondering if there's money in the kitty for all-season roads in the Northwest Territories, if there's money in the kitty for runway reconstruction, because when the permafrost melts, the runways crack. If there's investment for port construction in the north, which is not so much for export as it is for bringing goods and services into the people of the north.
Yes. So, yes, there are projects that have been announced and are underway, airport road projects. Yes, airports and roads would be a priority, not only for the Arctic Infrastructure Fund, but also for the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund. The calculus around Canada's sovereignty and Canada meeting its NATO commitments also will result in significant defense spending in that region. So I think something that has changed since the 4 years ago that we testified is that we know there will be significant investments in the North and the Arctic related to our defense infrastructure. So there is a strategic opportunity to look at dual-use infrastructure that benefits the local communities, as well as providing our strengthening our defense capabilities. So that is a priority that's going to be happening, and I think for us there's an opportunity to make sure that there's alignment there, and it would allow for an accelerated development and something that benefits the community and allows us to strengthen the transportation network.
Mr. Quick one. The Vancouver Airport, built on an island, sea island. I was there last week. Great airport. Our report gave me concerns that it faces the risk of, I kept saying sinking into the sea, and my husband said it's not sinking, the water is rising. It's being inundated. It's not the same thing. What we heard in our study is that the maintenance of the dike works falls to the city of Richmond, which is a smaller municipality in Metro Vancouver, that frankly doesn't have the resources to perhaps rebuild a dike work sufficient to protect one of Canada's most critical airports. So I wondered if anybody at the table could tell us if there are plans afoot to assist in bolstering the dike works around this critical piece of infrastructure.
Quick response, please. We're running out of time.
In 2021, there was $38.4 million from the Transport Canada's Airport Critical Infrastructure Program that did go to the airport for dike reinforcement.
5 years ago.
Yeah.
Anything since?
Just some additional funding for the runway and safety area.
I'll have a second round if I may.
Thank you very much. Suivant. Next, Senator Quinn.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, folks, for being here this morning. I want to touch a little bit on the east and on the north and on the seaway. But I want to pick up on what Senator Simon just talked about with respect to the dikes and how important they are to the airport. I understand that you folks have been involved in tabletop exercising down in the area of the Schenectady Isthmus, which my colleagues are probably tired of me talking about. But as I go there, I just want a couple of quick questions. One, to Mr. Santa Cruz, you talked about the importance of Vancouver in terms of doubling our exports and et cetera, et cetera. How important is the Halifax port to our strategy in diversifying trade lanes, exports, et cetera, and partnerships? How important is that port?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think if Canada is going to meet its trade ambition, we have to leverage all of the gateways and the corridors and the assets that we have. So I view the East Coast as an important opportunity to support diversified trade and provide access to markets that Canada traditionally hasn't in the past.
And so the tabletop exercise, I understand, focused on some of the risk and associated with the isthmus. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are those risks? What are your concerns with the trade corridor that goes through there?
Jeff, did you want to take that one about the risks? Or, okay. So yes, thank you, Senator, for the question and the comments. And yes, Public Safety Canada, through our Atlantic Regional Office, did help coordinate a tabletop exercise, or TTX as we like to call it, with funding from Defence Research and Development Canada, or DRDC. And that was a multi-stakeholder exercise that looked at some of the transportation and supply chain risks for the Chignecto Isthmus, which, as you are well aware, is one of the most vulnerable points in the country to the impacts of climate change, principally sea level rise and being then cut off, which would have a supply chain impact. And we have seen other examples around the country, whether it was the 2021 atmospheric rivers or any other sort of rail or port disruptions, the impact that can have, which I think makes it increasingly important for a broadly resilient critical transportation infrastructure system with redundancy built into it, as my colleague from Transport was saying. I think the importance of the tabletop exercise highlighted some key issues in terms of specific roles and responsibilities, recognizing that it is multi-jurisdictional. There are private sector and different levels of government, including Indigenous governments, that play a role in the Chignecto Isthmus in particular. And that is one area where I think that by conducting tabletop exercises and highlighting or daylighting some of the issues, we can focus in on specific problems that need to be resolved through funding or further engagement or other measures that may be in place.
With respect to resiliency of our trade corridors, would you agree that the governments would be well advised to get a coordinated approach and get it underway as soon as possible, given the effects of climate change and the increasing frequencies of storms in that area?
Sorry, a coordinator for
that we should take a more immediate approach to addressing the dikeline, the dikes, and the abattoir and the related works to get those addressed sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Again, thank you for the question. I think that the government of Canada, by virtue of the number of departments and agencies that are involved in this issue, going back to Senator Simon's question about when things have started coming together, climate change impacts and adaptation is something that certainly the government of Canada has been a leader on for a number of decades, and while we can possibly, those of us who work in the field of impacts and adaptation can bemoan the differences in funding that we have invested on climate change mitigation versus impacts and adaptation. I would argue that the more urgent need in terms of resilience is on funding for impacts and adaptation, which I think the government of Canada has over the years, 15 to 20 years, demonstrated some significant, maybe not enough, but significant investments in climate change, including in Atlantic Canada. And I think that we all recognize that more needs to be done in the spirit of continuous improvement.
I want to shift another part of the country.
Sure.
And just in concluding that part of the country, it's probably a good thing then that the government has identified funding for the particular area that I've been questioning about, and that's the isthmus. So I'm going to shift now.
More questions, Senator, because we're running out of time.
I understand. The Seaway. We had some discussions about short sea shipping and the benefits of short sea shipping in terms of highway congestion, greenhouse gas emissions, and things like that. Is that a real possibility to reduce highway congestion and the movement of cargoes along the seaway by using short sea shipping and getting trucks off the roads and all the things that go with that, less maintenance on the roads, et cetera? What are some thoughts on short sea shipping specifically in that area?
Thank you for the question. I think it's transport view that short sea shipping does provide an opportunity to unlock new trade corridors and export opportunities in addition to reducing emissions. The St. Lawrence Seaway is a good example. So that's something that we take into consideration in our design and how we want to implement our programs. And we've had different funding programs to support it. But generally, the short answer is yes, we're supportive.
Thank you, Senator Cormier. Senator Cormier.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma première...
Thank you, Chair. My question, and in fact, follows the previous one. It's for my colleague from New Brunswick. It's the Chinook to Isthmus. I think this could be addressed to Mr. Swartz. You spoke about collaboration between the federal government and the provinces and territories. More tangibly speaking now, I'd like to know what the federal government's expectations are as it works together with the provinces and the communities that are impacted in this region, more specifically the Acadian communities. I believe that there was construction in this region. So what are your expectations regarding expertise, regarding the engagement of the public, the private sector in this? What could you say about these tangible expectations that the federal government has regarding the increased risk of flooding? Thank you, Senator, for that question. I'll be answering in English if that's okay for you, because it's easier for me.
I think that the federal government's expectations are that it would respect the jurisdiction and the roles and responsibilities of other stakeholders in the region. And I don't say that to sound dismissive in any way. What I mean is that I think the federal government expects to meaningfully engage with the private sector communities in the region, recognizing that climate change impacts and adaptation and critical infrastructure resilience, including in the transportation sector, is very much a shared responsibility, just given the division of authorities and responsibilities. So I think that the expectations are that the Government of Canada, through various departments and agencies, including Public Safety, Transport Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and others, it's very much a strong federal family, if I could say that, when it comes to the issues of critical infrastructure resilience and climate change impacts and adaptation. The expectation is that we work together and we work closely with stakeholders to provide information.
Excuse me to interrupt, but have you identified specific expertise coming from those provinces and from the private sector, just so we can be reassured that they'll be involved in this important project? So I don't know if you have any more information on that. Maybe
I'll just check with my colleagues. Jeff, is there anybody on the climate side that in Atlantic Canada or? No? Okay. I guess I'd have to say I'm not aware of anyone specific, although more broadly speaking, we would work with regional stakeholders, including the provinces and territories. I know that's a very high-level answer, but I think it kind of depends on the specific nature of the issue.
My second question is for all our three witnesses. Given that the Official Languages Act provides that the legal obligations with respect to official languages apply at all times, including during emergency situations, how will Safety Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, how will these two departments ensure that they will fulfill their official languages obligations? We know that there have been some major issues in communication at a certain point when it came to an emergency situation, for instance, during the pandemic. So concretely speaking, how are these official languages considerations taken into account at the department? I'm thinking about the mitigation fund, among others. So, gentlemen. Well, I can speak on behalf of my own department, and more specifically regarding Meteorological Services of Canada and the notification system that has undergone a number of updates over the past few years to ensure that all notifications are published in both official languages, either through direct notifications or through other means of sending out these notifications, these warnings to the alerts, rather, to the general public. So all of this information is published in both languages. And how can do you have any means to assess how efficient this is? Once again, we've received comments that it's difficult to receive services in both official languages. I can't speak on behalf of my colleague at the other department, but that is not the part that I'm responsible for. The department, I do realize that the department does take part in these regular updates on the efficiency and working of the system. Mr. Schwartz?
I would make specific reference to, I acknowledge the issue and the challenges faced there, and oftentimes in emergencies, I think there is a natural tendency to expedite the provision of information, even if it is in one official language, versus respecting some legislative official languages obligations. I will say, however, that there have been improvements, and I think this is specific to your question on Canada's National Public Alerting System. The National Public Alerting System warns of disasters, imminent extreme weather that can provide advance warning so people can flee an area if their safety is at risk. So the Government of Canada makes sure that people receive these NPAS, or National Public Alerting System, warnings. So budget 2025 proposed $55 million over 4 years, starting this fiscal year, to support a new national public alerting system model, ensuring that Canadians continue to receive Amber Alerts, they continue to receive extreme weather warnings, imminent natural disasters, and related security threats so that they can take action. One element related to this is another a program that I think is relevant to this committee and to the issue of critical transportation infrastructure and resilience is the Earthquake Early Warning Program, EEW, that is administered by Natural Resources Canada. Public Safety Canada with Natural Resources Canada work together with industry, critical infrastructure stakeholders to locate seismic sensors on critical infrastructure to provide advance warning so that transportation infrastructure such as rail lines could be stopped in advance of an earthquake. So, and there are, again, official languages considerations there as well, and ensuring that Canadians receive messaging and alerts that protect their safety and security in both official languages. So I would just close on that question, Mr. Senator, by saying that the National Public Alerting System does fully recognize Canada's two official languages.
Suivant, next, Senator Aucoin.
Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing before the committee today. I would like to ask a question regarding maritime transport. This is the short-distance shipping. Is this really profitable? It's something that we've been discussing for years now. We've spoken about the cost of the infrastructure that needs to be put in place. And perhaps you could speak a little bit more about what this could imply and which corridors. I have many, many questions about this, of course. I don't quite know to which witness to address the question, but I'd like you to comment on that, please.
Transport Canada perspective, we're looking at all modes of transportation and all ways of moving goods and people. So from a short sea shipping or maritime perspective, I think we're open to supporting new models and ways of supporting those activity. That, we support it both through the way we administer and deliver our programs, and also through the governance. So creating the conditions to allow these activities to happen. So for us, it's facilitating and enabling it, and letting the market kind of find a model that works.
Est-ce que les autres invités ont des...
Would our other guests like to comment? Do I have time to ask a further question? Thank you. Regarding Canadian infrastructures and standards, we talked earlier about melting permafrost. We said that climate change is affecting transport in northern Canada. In light of what we've seen in Greenland and the United States, will this have an impact on the speed and the money that will be invested in Canada's north? It could be as far away as Churchill, but it could be also closer to Greenland. And there's infrastructure there. So what is taking place on that level in order to bolster the existing infrastructure? It's a competitive environment.
Or that Canadian assets and gateways are competitive, and create the conditions to invite the investment that's needed to support our trade. We've done exercises where we've mapped sort of the trade enabling infrastructure. We've also done it in partnership with the U.S. on our border crossings. So it's something that we're very, very attentive to, and it's front and center for us in looking at how we're going to deliver the next generation of infrastructure funding.
Je peux parler just a petit peu.
Go ahead, sir. You'd like to add?
I was just going to add with regard to the question about permafrost thaw that in my opening remarks I mentioned the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. We work very closely with other science-based departments, especially Natural Resources Canada, that is providing us with information in terms of the dynamics of permafrost thaw and how we can use that to develop tools to support the investments in either dual-use infrastructure that my colleague mentioned, or other investments that the Department of National Defense may be envisioning in that part of the country.
Thank you. That's fini. Suivante next, Senatrice Miville-Deschênes.
Senator Miville-Deschênes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to come back to one of the recommendations in the report, recognizing that the maritime transport is the least polluting today, that the Government of Canada lessen regulation or relax regulation to ensure that the ports of the Great Lakes can do more to increase their capacities and resilience. This comes from our study. We noted that there was a great deal of regulation which prevented specifically the ports from working together, because when they work together, they are then blamed that they are undermining competition and undermining competition laws. It's a bit of a catch-22, and I was reminded that in order to dig into the St. Lawrence River, because it fills up, we are then unable to achieve coordination between the ports. So what have you done since the report was released more than a year ago? Have you worked on this issue to ensure that the St. Lawrence Seaway as well as Lake Ontario be more efficient in order to bring together the efforts to fight climate change? The issue is to facilitate transport always.
The different governance structures that are in place interplay with each other. And it's something that we're mindful in the policy work that we're doing, understanding if there are barriers on to how we could unlock that to allow for that type of collaboration. And you know, the business model is there for them to demonstrate their capacity. I think there's an opportunity with the trade diversification priority and the focus to look at how you can accelerate and bring into focus the collaboration to tap new markets and new opportunities.
Okay, that's pretty vague, but maybe that's where you can go. Second question, ça a été,
Senator Quinn began by addressing this. We've also focused a great deal on maritime transport as being a means of having transportation that emits less greenhouse gases. So since this report was realized, have you conducted studies to see what could be done at each of your departments in order to promote this type of maritime transport? And what has been done concretely to ensure that not only we're lowering greenhouse gas emissions in other infrastructures, but in this case that we make better use of maritime transport in order to pollute less, to have less air pollution rather?
Your colleague, we are studying it. We have been studying and looking at the you know, the opportunities, and so it's something that we are looking to release in 2026. You know, I know I was being a little bit cryptic, but you know, the intermodal, I think from a trade perspective and from a resiliency and from a redundancy standpoint, it's important, right? It gives you an alternative to transportation that can serve our needs, both as an ambitious trade agenda and also in emergency. So I think we recognize the importance in looking at all of the different ways that we can help unlock that. We'll do that. At the end of the day, it's still a largely private sector play, and they have to play a role in demonstrating the commercial viability of it. And any tools that we have in our toolkit to help support it, we would look to using, whether it's dedicated program funding on decarbonization, whether it's in the maritime sector, or whether it's on infrastructure investments that can be made, that kind of take a holistic supply chain approach. Rather than a single project, we're looking at groups of projects that would work together, and that would be something that short sea shipping in St. Lawrence Seaway and other avenues would benefit from.
Est-ce que j'ai le temps? Plus de temps? Fini?
Do I have any time left? Perhaps during the second round?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
I'd like to begin by just thanking you for bringing up the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Green Fund and topping it up. When funding can go directly to municipalities from the federal government, it's great. Municipalities, communities are where the floods happen, the fires happen, and they know what's happening on the ground. So kudos for that. It's a really great organization, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and they do an excellent job. I'm now going to pick up the mantle of Senator Quinn on the Chignecto Isthmus, and you've talked about it being, one of the most vulnerable points in Canada, that we need a more immediate approach, that you've, had your TTX, I like that, table talk planning exercise, you mentioned all the different people involved. Where can I find out if there's a timeline and sort of where the action is? Like, what are the next steps? Is there a place that I can point citizens to, for example, so that they know? But could we get any sort of tangible deadlines on anything around that?
Okay, so thank you for the question. I think I would invite Housing and Infrastructure Canada, who's providing funding under their disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund for that project, as to the status and kind of the key next steps.
All right. Senator Simons?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My question this time is going to be for Mr. Schwartz. The 9th recommendation of our report deals with, I guess, what you might call emergency preparedness, which I know is a slightly different thing than public safety. And I was very keen. I shared the report. I gave my last hard copy to Minister Ashevsky sort of a week after she was made a minister. I gave her that for homework. But as an Albertan, we faced a number of catastrophic disasters in our province. The evacuation of the city of Fort McMurray, the evacuation of Jasper, and the one that didn't get as much media attention but was every bit as dire was the evacuation of the Little Red River Cree Nation in the high north of Alberta. In every case, there were huge problems with transportation corridor limitations and getting people out safely. So from a Public Safety Canada perspective, I wonder if you could engage with the 9th recommendation, which calls for the Government of Canada to work with provinces, territories, municipalities, and Indigenous communities to ensure that emergency plans and supplies are in place in the event of extreme weather events. So, I mean, that could be not just forest fire evacuations, but other extreme weather events, because a theme that came up again and again and again in our study is that we were not prepared within communities to deal with sudden catastrophic events, whether those are floods or fires or, I mean, climate change is not earthquakes, but, you know.
Could be, depending on
but,
speed.
yeah, you know. Well, if they're caused by fracking, I suppose, indirectly. But I'm just wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about recommendation 9 and whether you think the government is doing enough to meet that recommendation, what you are doing, and how you're liaising with other orders of government.
Sure. Thank you very much, Senator Simon, for the question. Obviously, there is a number of good recommendations here, and at the outset, I think Madame la Vice-Présidente asked which ones kind of stood out, and this was one for me, just given the role that we have at Public Safety Canada to demonstrate national leadership on emergency management. And yes, your point about the Jasper and the Cree Nation evacuations are well taken. Within the Government of Canada, within Public Safety Canada, we have something that's known as the Government Operations Centre, or the GOC. You may very well know of that. The the Government Operations Centre is responsible for national coordination, federal coordination, I should say, during emergency situations, be it a pandemic, a wildfire, a flood. The GOC activates on an annual basis to coordinate with departments and agencies in Canada, within the Government of Canada, but also the Provincial and Territorial Emergency Operations Centre. So there is that coordination in terms of emergency responses and briefing up, and then federally this would brief up into the Incident Response Group, the Cabinet Committee.
I guess recommendation, though, I mean, I have great respect for the work of the Government Operations Centre, and, you know, I was a journalist during the Fort McMurray wildfire. I covered that story. But our recommendation speaks to preparedness en avance, if I can put it that way.
So that is one of the core pillars of, to get more quickly to your question, I suppose, without all the surroundings. Preparedness is a core pillar of Canada's emergency management system. It's preparedness, prevention, recovery, and response. On the preparedness side, we do have, as we have, I think, all mentioned today, we take an all hazards risk management approach. The Emergency Management Act, Section 6 of the Emergency Management Act does state that all ministers responsible for reporting to Parliament have emergency management plans in place. So that's departmental, federal. We also work through the senior officials responsible for emergency management. That's the SORM committee, which is an FPT senior level committee responsible for coordinating on emergencies and disaster management. I would say that more work needs to be done here, and this is part and parcel of public safety's work to, we're calling it EM modernization. This is something that we're doing in response to the recognized threat of the growing impacts of wildfires, floods, and other climate impacts and natural disasters and natural hazards, to better prepare for these types of events and have those emergency plans in place, recognizing that, again, it is multi-jurisdictional. Municipalities need to have them. Provinces and territories have them. And then the federal government activates its plans through the Federal Emergency Response Plan, or the FERP. The private sector, I would say, also has a very important role to play here in terms of planning and response, as do sort of non-governmental organizations. The Red Cross is one. Humanitarian workforce is something else that public safety has been working on. That's more on the response and the recovery side, but on the planning and prevention side, I'll give you one example of a provincial initiative that has been set up. It's called Ontario Corps. Ontario has created an emergency preparedness and response mechanisms whereby they partner with industry and private sector stakeholders. And most recently, Labatt's signed on to Ontario Corps to provide its logistics and supply chain expertise, as well as its warehousing capacity, such that we are prepared in advance. Of course, related to this are things like the National Emergency Strategic Stockpile, or the NES, all of which contribute into being better prepared nationally. But I would say, generally speaking, that given the size of the country and the scope of the challenge that we face, we need to be better prepared, and we need to work towards being better prepared.
There will be beer for Canadians in a time of crisis. But
beer and hockey, it's a top priority. We're on it.
Because Mr. Sandor Cruz, I mean, when I referenced the Little Red River Cree Nation, which wasn't part of our study, but which it's far enough north in Alberta that it's kind of the north. Because they were cut off by road, they had to evacuate a sizable community. It's one of the largest First Nations in the province. They evacuated by canoe. They evacuated by barge. And then they got some small planes in. But, it was a miracle, frankly, that they were able to get everybody out safely. I mean, evacuating, 1,000+ people by canoe and barge takes a long time. And it's a credit to the nation that they got people out in time. But it really drove home to me the vulnerability in many of our more isolated communities, and frankly, even in the city of Fort McMurray, where there was, one major highway south. It's not just a question of emergency preparedness, it's a question of having the transportation infrastructure in place in a time of crisis so that people can get out of the way. And I don't know to what extent Transport Canada is looking at those issues. So, you mentioned, and I found this a little bit unsettling, that, the way we might get roads and ports in the north is to pretend that is under the penumbra of defense spending. But surely defending the safety of Canadians should be as big a priority as defending the sovereignty of the North.
Comment? We need to move forward, so quick comment, please.
I would just say that the dual use in the Arctic infrastructure it's one tool in the toolkit. We have many others in broader transportation infrastructure program and programs for airports, and all of that is part of the consideration, the remote access and connecting communities and the vulnerabilities.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator. Moving on, Senator Quinn.
Thank you, Chair. Just a short question, I hope. It's the Arctic, Port of Churchill. It's been a point of discussion for decades. Now it's considered a major project under the new government approach, and it has great potential. What are the biggest concerns that you may have from a Transport Canada point of view, emergency planning in particular, for that, both from the land side and sea side?
Thank you for the question. The Churchill Corridor project has been referred to the Major Projects Office, and Transport is supporting their analysis and work in that. So that will include an assessment of kind of what are the infrastructure needs to bring it to par. There'll be an examination of the longer term needs.
So I understand it, but I know it's been a topic for a lot of years in transport. I was part of it. What are some of those concerns in today's particular situation? I know it's going to the Major Project Office, but it's been something that's been on the roster, if you will, of transport for a long time.
So there will have to be an assessment on the commercial viability, like the port itself will have to attract and get the business. From a safety and resilience, there will be considerations around the safety of the route, the ability to deal with oil spill or emergency response. So that will all be part of the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Senator. Moving on, Senatrice Miville-Deschênes.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I apologize. I've missed the first few minutes, so if I ask you to repeat your questions, I hope you don't mind. In 2023, the Government of Canada published its National Mitigation Strategy. And I'd like you to explain to me, if you will, what the measurable objectives in the short, medium, and long term are, that is, regarding the resilience of both public and private infrastructure.
Who would like to respond? Mr. McDonald?
Mr. McDonald, je crois.
Oui, merci pour la question. So with regard to the adaptation fund, there are targets, objectives, and goals for each of the systems in the National Adaptation Strategy. I can pull it up here, but I could also provide a copy of the strategy to the committee.
You have to give us a few highlights that would stick with our study.
Yeah. So the way that the strategy is designed, it is, and it's one that was taken through best practices from other countries, is really one based on systems. And there are 5 systems identified in the NAS. There's disaster resilience. We've talked a lot today about a lot of the goals and objectives there. There is infrastructure itself, so I'll get to that in a moment. There's also health and well-being, as well as nature and biodiversity, and finally the economy and workers. And each of those 5 themes, in terms of how the Government of Canada has organized itself, is led by a specific department. And so in the case of infrastructure, it's Housing, Infrastructure and Communities Canada. But being a lead for a system means coordinating with other departments and agencies for the goals and objectives and the targets in the National Adaptation Strategy. So the overall goal in terms of improving the resilience of infrastructure in Canada is, as I was mentioning earlier, about mainstreaming the integration of how the climate is changing into the design and construction of housing and infrastructure in Canada. And so there were some short-term targets that were there. In my remarks, I mentioned specifically about a new codes for bridges and their design. That's an example of a target that's been met under the National Adaptation Strategy, at least in the first phase. But with regard to other aspects of it, some of the work, as we've mentioned as well, it's interdepartmental, but it's also inter-system when it comes to some of the questions. We consider infrastructure from a disaster resilience, the redundancy for evacuation purposes, but similarly for the economic reasons as well. So our colleagues in Natural Resources Canada, and I think this is getting way back to one of the questions that Senator Lewis asked earlier, was about regulation versus design and those types of questions. We have done a lot of work with the engineering community and the architectural community, both through direct consultation with them, as well as through supporting mid-career development training for engineers and architects to help them integrate climate considerations into their work and in considering the duty of care that they have in terms of providing their services to governments and obviously private sector when it comes to investment in infrastructure. Some provincial governments, notably the government of British Columbia, has made this kind of resilient design a part of its tendering process, but they did go out of their way to make sure that there was a capacity and an ability to respond to those requirements in tendering processes, such that you can build resilient infrastructure and the services would be there to provide that. So I can provide some more examples to the committee in terms of the targets and objectives as it relates to infrastructure, but just give you an idea of kind of how we've approached that. The overall goal of this phase of the strategy is how to mainstream this, and my own department with regard to climate services, as well as our colleagues in housing infrastructure community. We also provide services directly to the infrastructure community in terms of how to design that, in terms of how to understand the climate is changing and how to integrate that into these questions.
Okay, thank you, and I'm sorry I had to make you repeat somewhat.
No problem at all.
Thank you.
See, Senator. Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is specifically about some infrastructure in the Port of Vancouver. Mr. Santa Cruz, you referred to the fact when we were talking about the Fraser Valley about how some of the assets are owned by private sector players. And the two pieces of critical infrastructure in the Port of Vancouver that I want to ask about are, one, the new Westminster Rail Bridge, which was built when Canada was only 35 years old and still operates today, and the North Shore Rail Bridge, over which a lot of Saskatchewan and prairie grain and potash traverses in order to get to the North Shore terminals. The only access point to those North Shore terminals, particularly since CN is decommissioning it's the northern line north of Squamish. So I think there's, without question, those are two critical assets. We know that replacing them will cost billions of dollars. We also know, because one is owned by Public Works and operated by CN, the other one's owned by CN, that railways, as good as they are at building infrastructure and repairing things after disasters, they like to sweat the assets. And both of those assets have been, I think, they've sweated enough. And I'm concerned that I'd be interested to know if there is actually concrete work underway to plan for the replacements to the degree we actually know what it would cost. It's one thing for us, and you can hear around the room that we're all concerned there isn't enough money going into this critical infrastructure. But for some of these things, we actually need to know what we're going to build, and some of them are very complex, like the New Westminster Rail Bridge, what we're going to build in order to figure how much it's going to cost, so we can then start to figure out how to pay for it. And I don't think the railways are going to do that for us.
Thank you for the question. And yes, the North Shore is very key to supporting Canada's trade ambition. So the short answer is yes, there's work in understanding kind of the future costs and rebuild options. The Canada Infrastructure Bank just concluded a study on the new Westminster Rail Bridge. They funded the study. It's multi-partners involved in it. So there is work that's being done to look at what are the options in how to address the replacement or rebuild. And as I mentioned earlier in one of the questions, we're doing work around our capacity and capacity constraints. And so, the bulk exports through the North Shore and understanding kind of where those potential pinch points is part of that analysis, and hopefully will inform the future investments that the government make.
Thank you.
Senator Simons.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for indulging me with a third question. I want to circle back to where Senator Dasko began. I mean, our number one recommendation grew out of our finding that current efforts are scattered, that there is no national coordination, no concrete plan, and no predictable funding, and yet there is an urgent need to take action. And so our first recommendation was that we have a list of the country's most critical transportation infrastructure. And our second was that we have a concrete plan of action to protect that infrastructure. And despite all of the encouraging words we've heard from you today, I'm not clear that either of those things has happened. And maybe we are being idealistic. I don't want to say naive. We're too old to be naive. But in assuming that there is some sort of command and control at the top that can say, all right, here's a map of Canada. These are our greatest vulnerabilities and our top priorities. But is there any kind of central planning that is doing that kind of strategic look at where our most vulnerable points are? What is the risk-benefit analysis? If the Chinecto Isthmus is inundated, Nova Scotia becomes an island. That's a huge risk. But I'm just trying to get a sense of whether there's somebody sitting in a chair with a map and a spreadsheet figuring out where we need to go first.
Thank you, Senator Simons, for the question. I'll start with that, and I appreciate you bringing up the where we started with the recommendations. Public Safety Canada has the overall federal policy lead role for critical infrastructure protection, and in that context, through the National Strategy for Critical Infrastructure, organizes federal efforts through all the behind-the-scenes nuts and bolts stuff that you would, interdepartmental committees at various levels and cabinet proposals, MCs, et cetera. And I can say that in the intervening years, when I was here almost 4 years ago, that there has been a lot of work behind the scenes to show for that, some of which we can't speak about because it never made it to the light of day. But if I made, in my own opening remarks, a comment about how we've raised awareness and mainstreamed these issues across departments and agencies, that's what I was referencing to, is that specifically related to the question of the most important critical transportation infrastructure and the most important infrastructure writ large. I think that person would be me with a map and a spreadsheet. We have had maps and spreadsheets in the past that, and I would point back to the Vital Points program, which I always mess up and call the Vital Pints program as my CI Beer Club. But that Vital Points program was something that Canada operated throughout the post-World War years, throughout the 20th century, to maintain lists of Canada's most important infrastructure, vital infrastructure that needed to be protected. Now, in the context of the mid to late 20th century, this was very physical security focused, guards, gates, and guns. And that became very onerous and very expensive to send security agents from the RCMP or the Canadian Armed Forces to our major ports and bridges and airports to protect. Hence, we shifted away from that point-specific approach to an all-hazards approach that looked at shared responsibilities between different jurisdictions and where we find ourselves now. I think we lost visibility on what our most important critical infrastructure is in the late 90s when that program ended, and I think we are now in a recovery mode. I think we overcorrected when we said, nope, we don't need to keep tabs and keep lists of, and there were 7,000 plus assets at the time on 22 different lists across the federal government. I think we lost a lot of insight and visibility on our most important CI, which I think we are now trying to recognizing in the last 10 to 15 years in particular that we need to gain that visibility back. And we see some of this come up through different disruption events, whether convoy blockades was a great example. What's the most important infrastructure we need to protect? And do we have the legislative tools in order to protect that? So we are internally looking at reestablishing insight, visibility, knowledge of what CI is most important based on its general level of criticality or how important it is vis-a-vis other pieces of infrastructure, noting that redundancy is a key point of resilience. Also, we need to know who owns some of this infrastructure. It's not always, as I mentioned in the private sector, it's not always Canadian companies. So there are inherent security risks, national security risks related to ownership of some of our critical infrastructure, and a lot of that we can't unwind, but as we look at investing in the north or investing in new infrastructure through major projects, and we're looking at foreign investment in some of these projects, we will be ensuring that we use the tools we have through the Investment Canada Act and other mechanisms to ensure that these investments are protected for the most important infrastructure that we have. So long story short, Senator Simons, I would say that yes, we recognize the need to make lists, and some of that work is happening internally to the Government of Canada and is generally on a sector-by-sector basis, led by those departments and agencies who have the mandate, the authority, and the expertise on what they might consider to be the most important critical infrastructure in their sector. And then collectively we take that together, and there's a person again in a chair with a spreadsheet and a map looking at this is the picture, this is what we need to protect. I really believe that in order to protect our CI, we need to identify what it is.
That's a really interesting answer. So you're saying that there was like a kind of a Cold War paradigm
where
we were protecting infrastructure against invasion or
correct
protesters or what have you. But we really need to shift now to
correct
understanding that the threats are also from natural phenomenon to an extent that we didn't imagine
correct
in the post-war period.
Yeah, all hazards, all threats, yes. Yeah. You're welcome.
I'd like to ask the committee whether there's any other questions that you would like to ask. We've had pretty thorough discussion over the last hour and a half. And is there any other questions that you'd like to ask our witnesses on this subject? Because I have just one little kind of thought that I know it's hard for an old guy like myself to think about it, but I went through this, our report that we made that was drafted and we reviewed from 2024. And I thought it was just a fascinating report, and I know that there's so much complexity in the areas that you folks study. But there's one paragraph in the conclusion that I thought if there's any messaging that we can leave this meeting with, that you can assist us, and I know it's complex, but given the urgent nature of the issue, the committee has recommended, among other things, that the federal government create a list, and this supports some of the points that have been brought up by our members, of the most important transportation infrastructure as well as a concrete plan to protect it, while highlighting the need for stable long-term funding from governments and the private sector. Now, I recognize that there's so much complexity in this paragraph, but I guess the question that I would have is how do we get through the maze in identifying the national projects of critical importance to the future of our country? This was, I think, the idea of having this study and providing the study to you folks. But it would be really interesting to see how do you get through the maze? And that answer would probably take another 35 minutes, which we don't want to do. But I would leave that question with you, knowing that in good faith that you are able to kind of put some pieces together. Because I think one of the things we notice in the whole shifting paradigm of the world economy and what's going on with the states and what's going on with various countries, we have to be able to really prioritize, what are our top 3 to 4 projects that we need to get going on, shovels in the ground, people working, getting things done so that we can actually say we are proactive in maintaining our sovereignty, but more importantly, proactive in maintaining some of the issues that are so critical to the infrastructure of this country, which will only help us move forward. That's sort of just a thought that I had, which could be deemed a question, but if there's any way that you'd like to come back to us with a one-pager, and I know you doing a one-pager on an issue that probably would take 1,000 pages, it may not necessarily be doable. But could the three of you put your heads together and sort of, we need to come back and say, okay, what are the top 3 to 4 issues that we need to look at in this country in terms of getting solutions? And I'm not trying to be hard on you at all because I thought it was a fascinating discussion, but, having worked in business most of my life and sport and stuff, there always has to be answers to questions, and prioritizing is sometimes very difficult, and I recognize the maze that you have to go through to get to that point. But if you could give us just a simple idea of where are we going and how do we get through to the end zone to get the results? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we'd be pleased to follow up with this committee. And again, I think that your conclusion and your first recommendation is bang on. I also think that I would just point out that it aligns with one of the recommendations from the Public Order Emergency Commission report that was released following the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which is to identify our critical trade and transportation infrastructure. So I think that collectively we can certainly come back to you. I think all that thinking has been done. It's a matter of, I think, as you say, Mr. Chair, synthesizing it down into a one-pager. But I would really agree with your comment on complexity and about the maze. It is a maze, and I think the way through the maze is consultation and engagement with the various stakeholders, which I know that all of our departments have done and will continue to do in order to find those solutions where there is common ground and we can leverage those different powers and orders of responsibility, which we've shown that we can do in other areas. And I believe that we can do it here as well, and we'll continue to work on that.
Could you get back to us by a certain date within, say, the middle of March? Would that be possible?
I think it would be possible, yeah, as long as it's not Friday, we can do it, yeah.
Okay, so do we have a date that we could give to our witnesses in terms of when we'd like them to get back to us by, say, the middle of March? What is a good day? What's your best day of the week?
To say Tuesday, March 17th, is the 17th okay? Senator Quinn's laughing. Sure, how about the 17th?
That would be fantastic.
Smack dab in the middle of the week and St. Patrick's Day.
Well, on that note, if we're all in agreement, let's adjourn the meeting, and we thank you very much for your testimony and your input. Thank you very much.